Hello, my name is Handel Smith, and I am recording my video specifically focused on Romans 1. And on page 13, I'll be answering the question, how conscious am I of the real goal of my life? And how orienting all that I do to the attaining of that goal. So first I'd like to talk a bit about Romans 1 and answering the question that was posed about Paul, really focusing on his understanding of how what God had called him to do. And I would like to again respond to a question that's on page 13. And that's actually the purpose of spiritual exercise is exercise 1. So, in the words of the introduction, Paul explained why he was writing the Roman saints, and he's a man with a mission, I believe, an apostle that I believe was commissioned to preach the gospel to the Gentiles, and so he's leading to the obedience of faith message, I think. I sense that he's a man of a great heart for the saints in Rome. He is rejoiced at the reports of their testimony, and Paul's motivation really is his message and his calling. It's really shaping and driving his life in Romans 1 here. So in my view, there's no doubt that Paul is committed to the gospel, that he believes that God is divine and powerful. Paul really seeks to conform his life to the calling that God has. He believes that he's been set apart to do great works for God. He also believes and his motivation is not just about having a healthy self-image, but the certainty that he was called to play a part in this divine plan and purpose of God. So he understands the power of service and of his indebtedness to Christ. Paul's life was in Christ. He really focused on service and worship. Paul also, his words and actions, even as an epistle to the Romans, he displays the sovereignty or the sovereign providence of God. He had a clear sense of the purpose of God, but not the details of God's plan, but he was clear and convinced that God was sovereign. He was also, he believes that the gospel is God's provision to meet all of our needs. He says that God will meet all of our needs according to his riches and glory. So the gospel should be the motivation or our mindset or our message and our means. And then he believed that, and I read it, that ministry is a long-term matter. And I read through the introduction, I read through the entire chapter, it becomes more evident that he's writing of the Romans and his involvement in ministry to the church, that it wasn't just a short-term gig, that he really believed that folks have been called to do the long-term work of ministry. He said, as I look at this long-term dimension of Paul's ministry, he says, I'm convinced by the short-term thinking of Christians he talks to. So we need to be long-term and consistent in our ministry call. He says ministry requires preparation and introduction. It takes time because it requires preparation and introduction. And then lastly he says that those who are used of God to communicate his heart to men are men who have a heart of God. And so he believed the importance that Paul's exposition of Romans is not only by how he expounded on the gospel, but his expression of the heart of God that I thought was powerful. And as I think through all the books of the Bible, I find that the men who chose to explore the heart of God and the depth of God were really powerful men. So this expression of God's heart was really where Paul was coming from. So with that, I'd like to answer the question. So how conscious am I of the real goal of my life? I believe that God has called me as a goal to become a Christ-centered, loving servant leader, helping people and organizations to reach their full potential. I believe that God has called me to be a minister because the definition of ministry is to serve. And Paul talks about the power of being a servant. Paul talks about preparing and being in it for the long term. My heart and desire is to serve God with all of my might, not unto man, but as unto God. That my motivation, like Paul's, is not just about a healthy self-image, but that I'm a part of a larger plan and a purpose of God. And I do believe that God is sovereign. And like Paul, I believe that my life is a calling, and that he's given me this gift of apostleship. And we look at the fivefold ministry, I believe that God has given me that gift, and that I've been set apart to do great works for Jesus Christ. Yes, I love Romans 1, and I love this message that Paul has as he pours out his heart to us and to the Romans as he describes his very, very powerful ministry that he's imparting to the people that he's communicating with. And so we thank God for Romans 1, we thank God for Paul, and we thank God for how God used him to communicate his heart to men and women, that they should have the heart of God. Thank you.